Welcome to This Constitution. I'm Matthew Brogdon, and I'm joined today by a very special guest to talk about the pursuit of happiness, one of the most memorable phrases from the Declaration, but perhaps one we don't fully understand. I have with me today Jeff Rosen, who is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. It's chartered by Congress, supported by generous gifts from the public, to help the public, much like the Center for Constitutional Studies, engage with and understand our constitutional tradition. Welcome, Jeff. I'm glad to have you on.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to see all the great work you're doing here at the Center for Constitutional Studies.
Well, thank you. Well, we're talking today about the book that Jeff has published recently, The Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. Now, you connect virtue and the pursuit of happiness. When we argue over the Declaration of Independence, every undergraduate class I've ever taught, you ask people what the Declaration of Independence means, immediately jumps to a debate between freedom and equality. Is the Declaration about liberty or is it about equality? Very modern Enlightenment ideas in many respects, not entirely. But you want to focus on virtue. How does the notion of virtue help us understand the Declaration of Independence? Where does it fit?
Well, it's so interesting. As you say, people usually say the Declaration's about liberty or equality. Sometimes they add the third big value of the Declaration, democracy or government by consent. But then there's that fourth central phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And what I learned by looking at the classical writers on virtue who inspired the phrase, that for the founders, the pursuit of happiness meant not feeling good but being good, not the pursuit of pleasure but the pursuit of virtue. And by virtue, they meant self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement. Essentially, they thought that personal self-government was necessary for political self-government. And as you say, when you view the pursuit of reason, virtue, self-improvement, and happiness as the core of the Declaration, then you see its various values not as different elements that are in tension, but as one harmonious whole.
When the founders think about virtue, when that generation, folks like the folks you talk about in the book, include Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, both John and Abigail Adams, and even go into a second founding with Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, how would they have understood the term virtue? If you said virtue to someone now, I don't know, ask 10 Americans, what's virtue? You might get a lot of different answers. Is there a common definition for this, a common understanding of what virtue is for this generation?
There was a common sensibility, and it was rooted in the classics, and in particular in the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. And the founders would add different variations on that, like industry or patience or order or resolution. But all of them are forms of self-mastery. In particular, it comes from Aristotle, and it has to do with moderation, the golden mean, and emotional moderation, moderating our unproductive passions or emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, so we can achieve productive emotions like the classical virtues. It takes a moment to explain because it's not intuitive. When Aristotle said that happiness is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, back then people understood what that meant. We don't, because the phrases mean something else. But if you had to sum it up in a single phrase, it would really be being a lifelong learner.
Okay, that's quite an aspiration. Now, the lifelong learning part, in taking up this subject, this wasn't just an academic study that you undertook. You actually, in the midst of COVID, decided to emulate an experiment that some of the founding generation had undertaken. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe that'll point us toward what this lifelong learner business is about.
Well, that really was the takeaway and the end point. During COVID, as you said, I set out to read the books on Thomas Jefferson's reading list that he said inspired his understanding of the pursuit of happiness. I was moved to do it just because I had noticed that both Jefferson and Franklin had picked this book by Cicero that I hadn't heard of called the Tusculan Disputations for their definition of happiness as virtue rather than pleasure. I thought I should read the book because it was so important to both of them. What else to read? Then I found this incredible reading list that your listeners have to check out if you really want to have a great reading project. It includes classical moral philosophers, Cicero, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, who's a really great philosopher to start with if you want to get into this stuff, and some Enlightenment folks as well. And I basically just set out to read it because I thought it was a gap in my education. And I spent a year doing it. Jefferson says you got to get up early and watch the sunrise and read for a couple hours, and that's what I did. It completely changed my life, my understanding of how to be a good person and a good citizen. But the biggest takeaway is it got me back into the habit of being a deep reader, which I had kind of gotten out of the habit of because I'm so addicted to these darn screens. And just setting aside a few hours in the morning to read is a habit I've tried to keep up. And that's what being a lifelong learner is for the founders. They read until they were old. And for them, that was part of being your best self and achieving self-mastery.
That sounds like quite an undertaking. I mean, the investment of time and discipline involved in devoting yourself to that kind of self-criticism, self-examination, and then learning from other sources. It occurs to me the founding generations engaged in that because many of these people live lives as part of a society where they occupy a fairly elevated social status and are people of means. Is it possible for a democratic society to continue that? I mean, in a way, the founders are sort of moving from a very hierarchical society, and many of them occupying chief positions in it, positions of influence. Is it possible in democratic life for the average democratic citizen to actually engage in that kind of reflection? I guess the Greeks would have said this was leisure. Right? You've got leisure to improve yourself and see to your intellectual formation and self-examine and learn. How do we implement that in a democratic age?
Well, you're so right about the Greek definition of leisure, and Louis Brandeis, who I think is a hero of both of ours, was so excited to learn that the Greek definition for leisure was unemployment, because you're supposed to use your unemployment time to elevate yourself, not to work less, but to work more on things like deep reading. Is it possible in a democratic society? Absolutely. And my answer is two words: Frederick Douglass. I mean, you think about the moment that Douglass felt most enslaved was not only when his body was enchained, but when his wicked master told him that he wasn't allowed to read or to learn how to read. What does Douglass do? He goes onto the streets of Baltimore. He buys reading lessons with bread. He pays boys to teach him how to read. And then he buys with bread this book called The Columbian Orator. And this is basically the most popular textbook of its time. Millions of copies are sold. It has short excerpts from the moral philosophy and a dialogue on slavery that inspires Douglass to be a freedom fighter, excerpts from Ben Franklin. This was basically what Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, people who were poor, had no means whatsoever, learned as the core of their learning in the 19th and up to the 20th century. And based on this one book, Douglass becomes the greatest freedom fighter of his age. And I have to tell you, every time I wake up in the morning and I'm trying to keep my rule and I try to swipe left to my Kindle rather than right to the browsing, I think, my God, you think of the sacrifices that a hero, a towering figure like Frederick Douglass could make just to learn to read and have access to books. Surely I can find the discipline to read these things, which are just all free and online. So I very much think it's the core of the American idea that all citizens, no matter what their privilege or their background, have an equal capacity to develop their talents, and really an inspiring opportunity today to do it now that all the books are online.
All of the hours I've spent watching TV shows, listening to podcasts, yours and mine accepted, of course. And, you add up all that time. What could it have achieved if invested in this kind of self-examination and this kind of reading, deep reading, you call it in the book?
It's so striking how all of the founders, and basically anyone who ever encountered this philosophy, they're constantly making schedules, how I use my time. And you're supposed to get up and read at a certain time. And Jefferson says read, and he tells you what to read when: 2 hours of moral philosophy, then breakfast, then history, then lunch, then politics, then science, then dinner, then Shakespeare. And they're always beating themselves up for wasting time. My goodness, we have such leisure with so many conveniences. It's really up to us to use time wisely. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be, says Seneca in his letters to Lucilius. And Washington reads this, and he just becomes obsessed with timepieces and having meals at the same time and exercise. And it takes so little not to waste time, to be mindful about time. And this doesn't mean that you have to be reading moral philosophy all the time. All of them were big on exercise and hiking. And Jefferson even prescribes, when you hike, you're not supposed to bring a book, although you can bring a gun, he said. But you just don't want to get too distracted. That's why the Stoic philosophy is so helpful in this age when we, for all of the demands on our time, we also have freedom to structure our schedules and hybrid work and all sorts of things that people have never enjoyed in human history before. It just requires being mindful about time.
I am intrigued by this moral seriousness that's involved in these experiments that the founders undertake. I think you point out particularly that Franklin, very famously, as he recounts in his autobiography, undertakes this method of self-improvement. He lists out the virtues, sort of daily records where he's failed in which of them, and eventually gives it up because there's just too many black marks against his name. I actually wonder, is that where the phrase black mark against your name comes from? I don't even know. But Franklin finds this. He undertakes this. Jefferson undertakes it. Who would you say had success in this? I mean, Franklin gives it up after a while, saying it's a worthwhile endeavor, but boy, I'm really failing on a lot of these. And where do you see success among these folks in sort of implementing this kind of moral seriousness?
Well, they were human, and to be human is to fall short of perfection. As Franklin said, Jesus and Socrates may approach moral perfection, and they do embody it, but not for humans, like the rest of us. But the one who most came closest in my book was John Quincy Adams. It's just amazing. I mean, he had it. His mom and dad hit him over the head with this. Imagine having John and Abigail Adams as your parents. And he is constantly beating himself up for squandering time. He says, if I only had more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He set a very high bar for himself. But then he comes close to achieving some of his goals because he becomes the greatest abolitionist of his time. He hadn't previously opposed slavery, but then two personal challenges befall him. He loses the re-election for president, and his oldest son commits suicide, George Washington Adams, partly because he can't deal with the pressure of John Quincy always telling him to be perfect and writing letters of a Christian father to his son. I mean, it was too much pressure. He becomes an alcoholic. He kills himself. In order to assuage himself and find a new sense of purpose, Adams rededicates himself. He rereads Cicero in the original. He reads the Bible. Based on reading the Bible, he becomes convinced that Jesus prophesied the freeing of the captives and that the Bible prophesies the end of slavery, and he becomes the greatest abolitionist of his time, according to Frederick Douglass, introduces the constitutional amendment to end slavery, forbids the gag rule in Congress, which he re-enters, which doesn't allow abolitionist petitions, and then he dies on the floor of Congress. He yells no in a vote against the Mexican-American War. He collapses, and his last words are, "I am composed," which he gets from Cicero. I mean, it's just amazing. And it's just and he did so much else. He was a leading Supreme Court advocate who won the Amistad case in favor of enslaved people. He wrote sonnets of virtue. He wrote the speeches on the Jubilee of the Constitution. It just shows how much you actually can achieve with focus and moral purpose.
And yet he's remembered as the man who stole the presidency from Andrew Jackson.
It's another reminder that our current vexations have precedence. And of course, Jackson did charge that there had been a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay to throw the election once it went into the House. And Adams never recovered.
So Adams comes through as a shining example and an impressive paragon of liberty and this kind of self-examination, living, you put it in summary fashion, that virtue is an effort to be good rather than feel good. And so I can see where Adams is a paragon of that. There's so many other stories of folks for falling short that happen here. And you talk about these in the book, in particular with, I think, Jefferson, and you mentioned some of his other Virginian colleagues who were at once very serious about conformity with their conscience, with their judgment about what was right and how they ought to conduct themselves, but also guilty of a real travesty with the ownership of slaves. So how did they deal with that? How did someone who's perpetrating slave ownership and owning human beings and trading in them reconcile that with this project of virtue and self-examination?
Through self-denial, hypocrisy, or in some cases, growth. I did find this speech that seemed to encapsulate the dilemma when Patrick Henry, who's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, says, "Is it not amazing that I, who believe slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves, I won't justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And that's the bottom line. In a moment of brutal truth, they knew it was wicked and wrong, but they liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. And then different enslavers were better or worse about reconciling this hypocrisy. George Washington did free his enslaved population at his death. George Wythe, who was Jefferson's mentor, became a real abolitionist and freed his slaves during his lifetime. Franklin himself grew and freed his slaves. But Jefferson was the worst of the bunch because he both always said slavery should end in the distant future and kept increasing the date, but lived like a Caligulan emperor at Monticello, surrounded himself with his own kids by Sally Hemings, who were serving him in his home, even as he denounced debt. And then the degree of his personal racism was unusual even by the standards of the day, and he belittled the talents of the great black poet Phyllis Wheatley because he said black people were intellectually inferior. So it was really just an unfortunate blot on the legacy of Jefferson, that he did recognize the hypocrisy at some level. He knew it was wrong, and he didn't want to live it as he did, but in the end he liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up.
So it raises a question for me with the prevalence of people who attempt this effort at moral perfection, really, at bringing themselves fully into conformity with what they know to be the right way to live. Seems to end in frustration for a lot of them, which points to a question. The kind of virtues that get listed. It was interesting to me that in the list of virtues that Jefferson, Franklin, some of these others would list, and the ones that make it into the book, the virtue of mercy or a recognition of human inability somehow to live up to a morally perfect standard seems to be absent in a way from some of those accounts. Is that right? Where was the place for how does a person who's so serious about that endeavor of living correctly, achieving moral perfection, how do they reconcile themselves to the inability? I mean, we talked about the answer over slavery, but slavery was hardly the sort of one thing, right? Franklin feels like he falls short in essentially every area, especially humility, right? Which he has to add in. The humility I think was suggested to him by a
Quaker friend.
A Quaker friend.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It wasn't in that list of pagan virtues that he had to start with.
And it's significant that it was a Quaker friend, and their emphasis on freedom of conscience and toleration was deeply rooted to their faith. It's such an interesting question. The classical virtues, it's true they're exacting, but they are virtues of the soul and of the heart, and they're meant to be practiced daily, and there's no expectation that you'll actually succeed. It's really about habits of trying to be more industrious or not to lose your temper, and of course you're going to be human is to fall short, but you don't have to actually be as perfect as Jesus. Now Jesus, of course, in the scripture, his disciples say, "Be perfect even as Jesus is perfect." I studied with the great Puritan scholar Sack Van Berkovich in college, and when he was discussing that passage, he said, I shouldn't say this perhaps, but isn't the disciple right? Shouldn't we try to be as perfect as Jesus? And the Christian exhortation to be perfect is combined with, as you say, empathy and forgiveness and the possibility of grace when we fall short. So both, whether you do it in a classical or Christian or Jewish or different faith traditions, there are different ways of dealing with the inevitable fact that to be human means we'll never achieve these virtues. But what's so striking about the founders is, for them, it really was the virtues of daily life, using your time well on a minute-by-minute basis. It wasn't about doctrinal enforcement. It wasn't the idea that you'd be damned if you didn't perform the rituals correctly, or it wasn't questions of heresy or blasphemy, of faith orthodoxy. And in that sense, it's more forgiving, because it's all about the individual and our own efforts to try to be more perfect, recognizing that we'll always fall short.
So a lot of folks would say, if we're going to focus on virtue, like if the pursuit of happiness is really the center of, if that's the political good, and at one point in the book you say you could almost take the idea of virtue and interpret it as human flourishing, the idea of virtue that the founding generation has. If in fact government exists to secure the right to pursue happiness as well as life and liberty, and of course, it being last in the list almost suggests a kind of order of a sort of ascending order, right? Everyone wants life, of course, liberty, to be free. But putting it last in the order almost suggests it's like you're ascending from mere life to liberty to the pursuit of happiness, to be good rather than just feel good. If that's the case, I think our modern instinctive reaction in the current moment, if you were describing this to a typical room full of folks, they'd say, well, but if politics is about virtue, I thought politics was about freedom, about doing what people want, or about equality, having some kind of recognition of our equality. Those are things that don't require a lot of moral judgment. And by bringing virtue in, or by saying that the Declaration places virtue at the center of political good and political life, do we risk returning to something older, maybe something more despotic than modern freedom? We're accustomed to modern liberalism, right? Politics is about freedom. How would you respond to that fear? People say, you want to bring virtue back into politics? That sounds like we're going to make politics about morality now, and we'll all have to duke it out from our varying positions on moral values. What would you say to the person who raised that kind of concern?
It's a very important concern, and I would say, far from threatening liberalism, the pursuit of happiness, rightly understood, is central to it and crucial to it. For the founders, the pursuit of happiness is not only but a right, but a duty. We have both the liberty and the obligation to achieve human flourishing by achieving our potential so that we can best serve others and the common good. However, the state has no role to play whatsoever in telling people how to pursue virtuous happiness. We must be protected on our right to think as we will and speak as we think, as Jefferson said, quoting Tacitus. And freedom of conscience is the central and first of the unalienable rights. Why is freedom of conscience unalienable? Because as Jefferson said, the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own mind, cannot be controlled by others. I can't tell you or even myself what to think because we can't control our own thoughts. They're the product of our reason. And even if we wanted to surrender the power to think to the government or to a tyrant, we can't. That's why conscience is unalienable, and its living according to right reason is both a right and a duty, but it can't in any way be controlled by others. And that's why for Jefferson and for the founders, liberalism and toleration in matters of faith was central to the idea of a free and flourishing society. Of course, there are very fundamental political debates about how a state should react to virtue, that the ancient Spartans had sumptuary laws and forbade people from buying expensive luxury goods and Teslas because it would be degrading, and other republics took a different view. However, the founders are also centrally moved by their reading of ancient history, and they fear that when citizens and leaders lack virtuous self-mastery, then republics go the way of Greece and Rome and surrender their liberties to tyrants and dictators who will give them cheap luxuries in exchange for centralized power. So the liberal vision, once again, is that kind of virtuous self-mastery of standing up for liberty, of calling out tyrants who threaten it, of not voting for demagogic leaders who will, subvert the Constitution, and to defend the Constitution at all is of a piece. That's why there's something so beautifully harmonious about the liberal idea, which says that personal self-government is necessary for political self-government.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't noticed before when I was reading this, didn't occur to me, but you connect this project of self-improvement and the focus on moral virtue that you find in some of the principal founders with the issue of religious conscience. And it seems to me the logic that you're articulating there shares an awful lot with the way that, for example, religiously devout Americans at the time of the founding, and since, have argued for expansive religious liberty and a freedom of conscience precisely because they take religion so seriously. You quote the mind can't be coerced, which Jefferson articulates in defense of the Virginia Bill for Religious Freedom. And of course, Madison's famous memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments articulates this too, that true faith can't be coerced. We're accustomed to that argument's been very persuasive in the field of religious liberty. You say, well, if you want to persuade, to evangelize, to convert, then you have to be talking to a free person. If the person on the other side of that conversation is not free to consider your arguments, either to reject them or accept them, then your efforts are in vain in some sense. So actually then there's a certain irony in this that either the devoutness of the believer that wants religious liberty in order to be able to evangelize and for themselves to be able to flourish in the performance of their own religious duties is analogous to the morally serious person who says, I want virtue. I want human beings to be virtuous. I want them to flourish. But in order to do that, you need a free people.
That is beautifully put, and you've so well expressed the deep connections at the time of the founding between religious liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And we see it in the Quaker insistence on freedom of conscience and the light within, and people like John Dickinson, who both are arguing for gender equality and racial equality as a result, and also forswear any attempt by the state to compel conscience, with the Baptists, who want total separation in order to protect religion from the state, and from the deep sense of religious seriousness of all the founders who had different understandings of orthodoxy or different relationships to different aspects of Christianity, but all of whom embrace this Enlightenment conviction that total freedom of conscience and devotion to public reason was compatible with faith. No incompatibility between them. There are illiberal manifestations of it, but attempts to impose theocratic dogma by authority rather than persuasion were rejected by the framers, and that indeed was the point of the First Amendment. Madison and Jefferson are the shining example of it. It becomes accepted by the Supreme Court. For me, learning about this deep core of conscience helps you understand why John Adams and Madison all said the greatest sources of faction are politics and religion, and religions will, people kill each other and fight wars about doctrinal matters of orthodoxy, but the ultimate devotion to freedom of conscience through public reason is far more important and is shared by all the faiths rather than dividing them.
So on this point of the compatibility of freedom and virtue, you quote, and this is the only place I've seen you quote this passage from Justice Louis Brandeis in his Whitney opinion. In the Whitney case, Brandeis writes a concurring opinion. This is a free speech case. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read the excerpt that you like to quote. Brandeis writes, "Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a public duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government, which is such, the close quote, that's such a profound meditation on the ends of liberty. What do you take him to mean there where he says liberty is not only an end but a means?
To the discovery and spread of political truth, which is right reason, which is the divine. He's read two documents that are focusing his mind. Jefferson's Virginia Bill on Religious Freedom, which he's just reread over the summer of 1926, and Alfred Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth, which is his favorite book, and he thinks 5th century Athens is the apotheosis of reason. And Zimmern quotes Pericles' funeral oration as saying, talking about liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. Brandeis is getting that from Pericles via Alfred Zimmern. What does Pericles mean? He's talking to the citizens of Athens, and he's saying it's courage to pursue the truth fearlessly. That is the core of Athens' greatness. We don't give each other black marks. We respect each other's privacy, but we're devoted to the public pursuit of truth and are not distracted by demagogues or the desire for cheap popularity or by other vexations. And that's why, for Brandeis, the pursuit of happiness is both a right and a duty. To fulfill the duty requires courage in the face of the temptations of error, but he has confidence that given our ability to use our faculties or powers of reason, those who won our independence believe the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties in its government. The reasonable forces should prevail over the arbitrary. He has faith that reason will prevail. It's this extraordinary faith in reason. It's an Enlightenment faith channeled by way of the Greeks that we have. The divine spark within each individual has the capacity through reason to access the divine. Just glorious.
It is. And I want to thank you in closing for giving us a way of thinking differently about the Declaration. As we approach the 250th anniversary of that document of American independence in 2026, this is a wonderful way to deepen our consideration of the really the civilization that supports and results in the Declaration of Independence. And it's so much richer than just a distillation of John Locke, profound as he is.
Well, thank you for reading the book so deeply, for all the wonderful work you're doing here at UVU, and for a great conversation.
Thank you, Jeff.